Ever wonder what happens when, like, the public's right to know bumps up against, stuff like journalistic freedom or a town council's desire to keep things on the down low?
Mm.
You sent in some really interesting case studies from North Carolina courtrooms, and I can't wait to dig into them with you today.
Okay,
We're talking open meetings, Law Public Records Act, the whole shebang.
sounds good.
These cases deal with real people and situations right here in North Carolina. So it's not just, legal mumbo jumbo. It's about how we stay informed as citizens.
You're right. It's not just about dry legal terms.
Right.
These cases often involve a real power struggle. Who gets to control the narrative? Who decides what information sees the light of day? It's fascinating stuff.
Okay, let's kick things off with a case that sounds like something out of a movie. Fresh Foods Incorporated versus XYZ Cable News. We're talking undercover journalists, hidden cameras, and a supermarket chain accused of some seriously icky practices.
This one reminds me of a landmark case, Food Lion versus ABC, which really clarified the legal landscape around news gathering techniques.
Mm-hmm.
The courts have generally said that news outlets can be held liable for how they get information, but not for publishing it if it's true.
So even if they had to bend the rules a bit, if the information they uncovered is accurate, they're protected.
In theory, yes. But it gets tricky when you factor in things like trespassing, privacy concerns, or even breach of loyalty if those undercover reporters were actually employees. The courts have to weigh the potential harm caused by the news gathering against the public's interest in knowing the truth.
That's a tough one. On the one hand, you have the right to a company's privacy, but on the other hand, if they're doing something dangerous or unethical, shouldn't the public know?
Exactly. And the Food Lion case highlighted this tension. The court found that while the journalists' methods were deceptive, the information they revealed about unsanitary food handling practices was true and of public concern. So they weren't liable for the harm caused by the publication itself, but they could still be held accountable for the way they went about getting the story.
Wow, so it's a real balancing act. What stands out to you about this case?
What's fascinating is how it forces us to grapple with the limits of journalistic freedom. Is it ever justifiable to break the law or even bend ethical standards in pursuit of a story that serves the public interest?
And speaking of bending the rules, let's move from the supermarket to the town council chambers. We've got Carteret Times going head-to-head with the town of Beaufort over some legal bills they wanted to keep under wraps.
Now, this case really boils down to one key question. What exactly is a public record? And thankfully, North Carolina has a strong precedent for that. The Womack case. It essentially says that if a record is created or possessed by a public official or agency, and it relates to public business, it's presumed to be public.
So even though it was a private law firm working for the town, those invoices are still considered public records.
Precisely. The Womack case expanded the definition to focus on the nature of the work, not just who's holding the documents. It shifted the burden of proof to the government. They have to demonstrate why a record shouldn't be public, rather than the other way around.
Makes sense. So the town tried to redact parts of the bills, claiming attorney-client privilege, but the Carteret Times argued that the public has a right to know how their tax dollars are being spent. What are your thoughts on those redactions?
Well, there are legitimate reasons to redact certain information, especially in legal documents. Things like specific legal strategies or personal information that could harm an individual's privacy are often protected.
Right.
But the question is, did the town of Beaufort go too far? Were they trying to hide something embarrassing or potentially illegal? Or were they simply trying to protect legitimate, confidential information?
That's where it gets tricky, right?
Yeah.
How do we know what's a valid reason for redacting and what's just a cover-up?
That's where in-camera review comes in. This is a legal process where a judge privately examines the unredacted records to determine whether the redactions are justified or if the public has a right to see the full information. It's a safeguard against government agencies hiding information under the guise of confidentiality.
Ah, so it's like having a referee step in and make the call.
Right.
Okay, moving on to Brevard News versus Transylvania County. This one involves a marathon closed-door session followed by a sudden vote on a new policy that wasn't even on the agenda. Sounds fishy, doesn't it?
This case really highlights the importance of the open meetings law. The law is very clear. Closed sessions are allowed only for very specific reasons, such as discussing legal strategy, personnel matters, or sensitive security issues. They are not meant for general policy discussions or decision-making.
So it's about preventing backroom deals and ensuring that decisions affecting the public are made in public, right?
Exactly. And there's a really important legal precedent that comes into play here, the Multimedia Publishing versus Henderson County case.
Okay.
That case essentially drew a line in the sand saying that you can't use closed sessions to hide policy debates from the public. You can't just hold a secret meeting and then pop out and announce a major decision.
So the county tried to claim that they were just getting legal advice about the new policy during that long closed session. But the Brevard News had some evidence suggesting otherwise, didn't they?
They did. They managed to obtain redacted minutes of the meeting, which revealed that the discussions went far beyond simple legal advice. The county was actually hashing out the specifics of the policy itself behind closed doors, which is a clear violation of the open meetings law.
So they were caught red-handed, basically, and the multimedia publishing case provided the legal ammunition to challenge them. It's interesting how these cases build on each other, creating a body of law that protects our right to know.
You're absolutely right. Each case helps clarify the boundaries of transparency and sets precedents for future challenges.
Now let's head to the mountains for Smoky Mountain Times versus Duckworth and Western Carolina University. This one involves allegations of mismanagement in the athletics department, a special commission to investigate, and a whole lot of secrecy surrounding the whole affair. What happened here?
This case is all about access to records. The Smoky Mountain Times wanted access to SBI reports, meeting minutes, and draft reports related to the investigation, but the university threw up a wall of exemptions to block them.
They really pulled out all the stops, didn't they? What were some of the exemptions they claimed?
Well, they argued that SBI records were exempt from disclosure, that the commission itself wasn't actually a public body subject to open meetings laws, and that releasing the records would violate attorney-client privilege. They even tried to claim that releasing the information would have a chilling effect on future investigations, making people reluctant to cooperate.
It's like they were throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what would stick. But the newspaper had a powerful precedent on their side, News and Observer versus Poole. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
News and Observer versus Poole is a landmark case because it established a key principle about SBI records. Once those reports are shared with another entity, they become public records. It also struck down the idea of a deliberative process privilege, which the university was trying to use to shield its internal discussions.
So no more hiding behind "we need to keep our deliberations secret" arguments.
Not in North Carolina. The court recognized that while some internal discussions need to be confidential, there's a strong public interest in knowing how decisions are made, especially when those decisions involve public funds or potential misconduct.
It's like trying to keep a lid on a boiling pot. Eventually, the truth is going to come out. This case shows that even powerful institutions like universities have to play by the rules of transparency.
You're right, and it emphasizes the importance of legal precedent in these battles for public access. Cases like News and Observer versus Poole provide a roadmap for journalists and citizens seeking to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, ready for another showdown?
Sure.
This time it's Joe Giglio, a well-known sports journalist, taking on North Carolina State University. It all centers around those closed-door meetings about athletics, finances, and conference alignment.
Ah, yes, the world of college athletics where money and secrecy often go hand in hand.
Right.
Giglio suspected that the university's board of trustees was having improper closed-door discussions about these issues, potentially violating the open meetings law.
And he had some pretty compelling evidence, didn't he?
He did. The board members themselves had inadvertently revealed in open sessions that they'd been discussing these sensitive matters behind closed doors. It's almost as if they slipped up and admitted to breaking the rules.
Oops. So Giglio, being the tenacious journalist he is, filed suit. And what did the university do?
Well, at first they tried to stonewall him, claiming that their closed sessions were perfectly legal. But then, rather abruptly, they decided to settle the case, and even agreed to pay Giglio's legal fees, a cool $25,000.
Wow, that's a pretty big red flag, wouldn't you say? It's almost like they knew they were in the wrong and wanted to make it go away quietly.
It certainly raises that question. Why settle and pay out such a significant amount unless you have something to hide? The settlement itself became a kind of tacit admission of wrongdoing, even though they never explicitly admitted to violating the law.
That's a win for transparency, even if it wasn't a slam-dunk legal victory. It sends a message to other public bodies. If you get caught playing fast and loose with the open meetings law, there could be consequences.
Absolutely. And it highlights the power of litigation as a tool for enforcing transparency. Sometimes just the threat of a lawsuit can be enough to make government agencies reconsider their actions and comply with the law.
Speaking of shadowy dealings, let's shift gears to a case involving a very high-profile figure, Elon Musk versus the town of Blowing Rock. This one raises some interesting questions about what exactly constitutes a meeting in the digital age.
Ah, yes, the Elon Musk case. This one really gets to the heart of how technology is challenging our traditional notions of open government. Musk purchased land for a facility in Blowing Rock, and the town council, concerned about the potential impact, started discussing zoning restrictions. But they didn't do it in a public meeting. They did it all through email.
Wait, so they were basically having a secret meeting via email. How does that even work?
Well, the town argued that those emails, even though they involved a quorum of the council and spanned an entire month, didn't actually constitute a meeting under the open meetings law because they weren't simultaneous.
Hold on. So just because they weren't all on a conference call or in the same room at the same time, it doesn't count as a meeting. That seems like a pretty flimsy argument.
It does raise questions about whether the simultaneous communication requirement, which comes from a case called Drum versus Pinehurst, creates a loophole that allows public bodies to sidestep the spirit of the law. After all, the intent of the open meetings law is to prevent backroom deals and ensure that public business is conducted in the open.
So should email chains be treated differently than face-to-face meetings when it comes to transparency?
That's the million-dollar question. The Drum case established that email exchanges can be considered meetings if they function like real-time conversations. So imagine a rapid-fire email chain where council members are responding to each other almost instantly, essentially having a back-and-forth discussion that could be considered a meeting. But a string of emails spread out over weeks might not meet that threshold.
Okay, so it's all about the immediacy and interactive nature of the communication. That's a pretty fine line, isn't it?
It is a nuanced distinction, and it underscores the challenges courts face in applying these laws to our ever-evolving digital landscape. We have to make sure the interpretation of the law keeps pace with the way people are actually communicating and conducting business.
Makes sense. We can't let technology become a shield for secrecy. Now let's talk about a case that's still unfolding in Durham, the Met Moriah Project. This one involves a digital magazine called The Assembly, shining a light on some private meetings between city council members and a developer.
This case raises some really important questions about the spirit of transparency. Even if no official action was taken in those private meetings, the fact that they happened at all, especially right before a crucial vote on a major project, casts a shadow over the entire decision-making process.
It's all about appearances, right?
Yeah.
Even if there was no quid pro quo, those private meetings create the perception of undue influence.
Exactly. And the Assembly is arguing that those meetings, while not technically violating the letter of the open meetings law, violated its spirit. They're also requesting access to electronic communications between council members, emails, text messages, the whole digital trail, which the city is claiming are not public records.
Wait, so the city's arguing that digital communications aren't subject to public records requests? That seems like a stretch.
It's a developing area of law, and there's a lot of debate about how to apply traditional public records laws to the digital realm.
It seems like a classic case of the law playing catch-up with technology.
It's a common theme, and it's why these cases are so important. They force us to confront how our laws need to adapt to the changing ways we communicate and conduct business.
All right, next stop, Charlotte, where the Charlotte Observer is taking on the city of Charlotte over its attempts to keep information about a land acquisition project under wraps.
This case is a classic example of a government entity trying to use exemptions to the Public Records Act as a blanket shield for secrecy. The city council went into a closed session to discuss acquiring land for a park, but refused to disclose even basic information about the property.
What kind of information were they trying to withhold?
Things like the location of the property, who owned it, and what the city planned to do with it. They tried to claim that disclosing this information would harm their negotiating position. But the Observer argued that the public has a right to know these basic facts.
It seems like a pretty reasonable request, doesn't it? I mean, we're talking about public funds being used to acquire land for a public park. Why all the secrecy?
The Observer suspected the city was trying to avoid public scrutiny and potential opposition to the project. And their suspicions were confirmed when the city, facing a lawsuit, suddenly decided to release all the information they had previously withheld.
So another case of a government agency backing down when faced with legal action. It underscores the importance of having a watchdog press that's willing to fight for transparency.
Absolutely. Without the Observer's persistence, that information might have remained hidden indefinitely, and the public would have been left in the dark about how their tax dollars were being spent.
Let's wrap up this segment with a case that focuses on the personnel matter exemption to the Public Records Act, the Samora Times versus the Caswell County School Board.
This one involves a superintendent who abruptly resigned, a hefty severance package, and a school board determined to keep the details shrouded in secrecy.
So the newspaper wanted to know what led to the superintendent's sudden departure and how much taxpayer money was involved in that severance package, but the school board wasn't budging.
That's right. They claimed that the closed session minutes documenting the superintendent's resignation and the terms of the severance agreement were completely exempt from disclosure because they were personnel matters.
But the newspaper argued that the public has a right to know how their elected officials are handling personnel decisions, especially when those decisions involve significant sums of money.
Exactly. And this case highlights the importance of a crucial legal concept, in-camera review. This is where a judge privately examines the disputed records to determine what's truly confidential and what the public has a right to see.
So it's not up to the school board to decide what gets released. A judge gets to make the call based on a careful review of the actual documents.
It's a vital check on the power of government agencies to withhold information. It ensures that the personnel matter exemption isn't used as a blanket excuse to avoid transparency and accountability.
This case is a reminder that persistence is key when it comes to public records requests. Even if an agency initially denies your request, don't give up. There are legal avenues to fight for access to information, and often that's what it takes to bring those secrets to light.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Transparency isn't a passive process. It requires diligence, a willingness to challenge those in power, and a deep understanding of the laws that protect our right to know. And sometimes it takes a real battle of wills to pry that information loose. Speaking of which, let's turn our attention to Christian Amanpour's fight against the city of Asheville.
Okay.
This one really highlights the frustration that often comes with public records requests.
Oh man, this one makes me want to scream sometimes.
Really?
I mean, we're talking months, even years of delays, all for some basic information about a development project. It's like pulling teeth.
This case really exposes a common tactic that some government agencies use to stonewall the public. Delay, delay, delay. The city of Asheville claimed they were overwhelmed with requests and had limited staff. But the sheer length of the delays, especially for a project with such significant public interest, suggests something more deliberate was going on.
Amanpour wasn't about to take "we're too busy" for an answer, and she ended up filing suit, claiming the city was violating the Public Records Act's requirement to provide records as promptly as possible. But what does that actually mean? Is there a specific time frame laid out in the law?
Unfortunately, North Carolina law doesn't explicitly define promptly, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation and for agencies to drag their feet.
Right.
The courts have generally said that the reasonableness of a delay depends on a bunch of factors, like the complexity of the request, how many records are involved, and the agency's resources.
So it's a bit of a judgment call.
To some degree, yes, but courts have also acknowledged that extreme delays can be a way of effectively denying access to information altogether. It's a form of constructive denial. Amanpour's case really highlights the need for clearer guidelines and stricter enforcement mechanisms to prevent these kinds of stonewalling tactics, which ultimately undermine the whole point of the Public Records Act.
Totally agree. And it's not just about bureaucratic delays either. The city tried to pull a fast one by claiming they had absolutely no responsive text messages, even though everyone knew that council members frequently use text to talk about city business. It felt like a blatant attempt to hide information.
It certainly raises that question, and it underscores the fact that our public records laws need to keep pace with technology. As more and more government business happens through emails, texts, instant messages, and social media, we need to make sure that those communications are subject to the same transparency requirements as traditional paper documents.
Right. It's not just about filing cabinets anymore. If you're using those tools to conduct public business, those records should be accessible to the public.
You're hitting on a crucial point. The definition of a public record needs to be broad and adaptable enough to encompass these new forms of communication. Otherwise, it's like we're giving public officials a license to operate in the shadows.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the theme of power and control. These cases, while sometimes frustrating, show that the fight for transparency is a constant back and forth between those who want to keep information hidden and those who believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Transparency is essential for holding our institutions accountable, promoting informed public debate, and ultimately protecting our democratic values.
Let's stick with the theme of government agencies trying to shield information from the public eye, shall we? The next case on our list pits the Charlotte Observer against the City of Charlotte, and it all revolves around a closed-door meeting about acquiring land for a new park.
This one really demonstrates how government entities sometimes try to use exemptions to the Public Records Act as a catch-all excuse for secrecy, rather than applying them narrowly and with good reason. The Charlotte City Council held a closed session to discuss purchasing land for the park, but they refused to even disclose the most basic information about the property.
What kind of information were they so determined to keep secret?
They wouldn't reveal the location of the property, who owned it, what they planned to do with it, or really any details at all. They claimed that disclosing this information would jeopardize their negotiating position and harm the city's interests. But the Charlotte Observer argued that the public has a fundamental right to know these basic facts, especially when public funds are being used.
It seems like a completely reasonable request. I mean, we're talking about a public park, a project that would ultimately benefit the community. Why all the secrecy? It makes you wonder what they were trying to hide.
Right. The Observer suspected that the city might be trying to avoid potential opposition or scrutiny from the community, and their suspicions were confirmed when the city, faced with a lawsuit from the Observer, suddenly decided to release all of the information they had previously withheld.
Classic case of we'll only be transparent if you force our hand.
Right.
It's frustrating, but it also highlights the vital role that a tenacious press plays in holding those in power accountable.
I completely agree. Without the Charlotte Observer's willingness to push back and demand transparency, that information might have remained hidden, and the public would have been left in the dark about an important civic project.
Okay, let's round up this section with a case that takes us deep into the world of personnel matters and the exemptions that can be used to shield information from public view. We're talking the Samora Times versus the Caswell County School Board.
Ah, yes, the personnel matter exemption. It's often cited by government agencies as a reason to withhold information, but it's not always clear-cut. In this case, the school board really tried to use it as a blanket justification for secrecy. It all started with the superintendent's sudden resignation, which was followed by a rather hefty severance package.
So the newspaper, the Samora Times, wanted to understand what led to the superintendent's abrupt departure and how much taxpayer money was involved in that severance package. Makes sense, right? But the school board wasn't exactly eager to share those details.
Not at all. They claimed that the closed session minutes from the meeting, where they discussed the superintendent's resignation and the terms of the severance agreement, were completely off limits to the public. Their reasoning: it's a personnel matter and therefore exempt from disclosure under the Public Records Act.
But the newspaper argued that the public has a right to know how their elected school board members are handling these kinds of personnel decisions, especially when those decisions involve significant sums of money. It's a matter of public accountability.
Absolutely. And this case really highlights the need for something called in-camera review, which can act as a check on the power of government agencies to arbitrarily withhold information under the guise of personnel matters.
Okay, walk me through how in-camera review works. It sounds a little like something out of a courtroom drama.
It does have a bit of intrigue to it. Essentially, if there's a dispute over whether certain records should be released, a judge can privately review the disputed documents. They get to see the unredacted version and determine what's truly confidential and what the public has a right to see.
So it's not just up to the school board to decide what stays hidden. A judge gets to weigh in and make an informed decision based on the actual content of the records.
Exactly. It's a crucial safeguard against government agencies abusing the personnel matter exemption to avoid transparency and accountability.
This case reminds us that persistence is key when it comes to public records requests. Even if an agency initially denies your request, don't give up. There are legal avenues to fight for access to information, and sometimes that's what it takes to shine a light on what's really going on.
Persistence and a willingness to challenge the status quo, those are essential qualities for anyone who wants to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from undercover journalists to secret email meetings to marathon closed sessions. It seems like there are a million ways that information can be obscured or withheld from the public.
It's true. Transparency is an ongoing battle, And it requires constant vigilance from journalists, citizens, and anyone who believes that an informed public is essential for a healthy democracy.
It feels like we've uncovered an entire arsenal of tactics used to, like, keep information under wraps, you know?
Yeah.
From flat-out denials to strategic delays, legal maneuvering, and a whole buffet of exemptions. It's enough to make your head spin.
It's true. There's a certain artistry, if you will, to the way some government entities try to skirt transparency requirements.
Mhm.
But on the flip side, we also have some powerful tools at our disposal to fight back.
Right. The Open Meetings Law and the Public Records Act are like our trusty shields and swords in this battle for access to information.
And just as important as the legal framework is the will to use it.
Yeah.
We need tenacious journalists, engaged citizens, and really anyone who values transparency to keep pushing, to keep asking those tough questions, and to hold those in power accountable.
These cases really drive home the point that open government isn't some passive automatic thing. It's something we have to actively defend, to constantly fight for. It's about demanding accountability, scrutinizing the actions of our elected officials, and making sure that decisions are being made in the light of day, not behind closed doors.
And at its core, it's about recognizing that access to information is the very foundation of a healthy democracy.
Right.
Without it, we're left vulnerable to manipulation, to abuses of power, and to decisions being made without our knowledge or consent.
So what does this all mean for you, dear listener? What are the key takeaways from all these courtroom battles and legal wrangling? Well, for one, it means staying informed, asking questions, and demanding transparency from your elected officials. Don't be afraid to make those public records requests, to attend those town council meetings, to speak up when something seems fishy.
And equally important, it means supporting local journalism. Those investigative reporters are often the ones on the front lines of this fight for transparency, digging deep, asking the tough questions, and shining a light on what's really going on. They need our support to keep doing that crucial work.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's made me realize that transparency isn't just some abstract ideal. It's the lifeblood of a functioning democracy. It's about empowering citizens, ensuring accountability, and creating a system where everyone is playing by the same rules.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And it's a fight that requires constant vigilance, ongoing engagement, and a deep-seated belief in the power of information.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on.
Okay.
What would a truly transparent government look like? If everything were public, if all deliberations, all documents, all communications were readily accessible, would it help or hinder good governance? Would it lead to more informed decision-making or just create chaos and paralysis?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that deserves a deep dive all its own. But in the meantime, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for a more transparent world.
That's it for this deep dive, but the conversation doesn't end here. Keep those questions in mind, and remember, when the lights are on, everyone behaves a little better.